All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining another MassMedic webinar. My name is Nicole Owens. I'm the Director of Marketing Communications for MassMedic. If you're not familiar with us, we are a trade association based in New England that works to bolster the medical device industry through education, events like this, connection, advocacy, and awareness. Today, we have a great webinar brought to you by Full Spectrum Software. We're going to be talking about AI in regulated medical solutions, the benefits and how you can take advantage of that. Before we get into that great content, just want to give you a couple housekeeping notes. This webinar is going to be recorded, so everyone who registered will get the content. We are going to have time for Q&A, so please feel free to put your questions as they occur in the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. And we are going to have a couple polls later on, so please be prepared to participate and be engaged. All right, with that, I am going to turn it over to our awesome panel. And moderating for us today is Matt Eisendrath. He is the President and the Chief Commercial Officer for Full Spectrum Software. Matt.
Thank you very much, Nicole. Thank you everyone for being here. It's really an honor. I wanted to start by introducing the panelists we have today. We have David Vogel, who founded Intertech Engineering Associates, a product development company in the medical device space in 1982. And he also is the author of Medical Device Software, Verification, Validation, and Compliance. And that is a authoritative book on medical device development, textbook that Dave put out. Dave, pleasure to have you here. You're on mute, but we had to get that out of the way.
Pleasure to be here and to be reminded. Thank you.
No problem. Next, I want to do Carlos Galmarini. Carlos is the founder and CEO of Topazium Artificial Intelligence. Topazium is based in Spain and focuses on actually developing algorithms in the medical device and life sciences space. Carlos is also a medical doctor who has a lot of experience working in drug discovery for some pharmaceutical companies as well. Carlos, great to have you here.
Thank you, Matt.
Next, I want to introduce Adam Hesse. Adam is the former program director of Medtronic's CareLink, as well as Becton Dickinson's infusion pump program. Adam is currently the Executive Vice President of Engineering at Full Spectrum. Adam, great to have you. And I'll just introduce or reintroduce myself, Matt Eisendrath, the President and Chief Commercial Officer at Full Spectrum. I'm the former head of medical device and life sciences for Capgemini's Engineering Research and Development Business Unit in the Americas, and it's truly an honor to be here. Wanted to provide just a little background on Full Spectrum. Full Spectrum is an outsourced product development firm. We provide engineering services in the areas of systems, software, electrical, verification, and compliance, predominantly for medical devices and regulated industries. And we bring some of that perspective to the discussion today. I want to move on now and make sure that I can share the slides that we put together. All right, so if I can just get a thumbs up from somebody that's all right, great. So I want to provide just a quick overview of the webinar we're going to go through. I'm going to introduce the webinar. We're going to move into definitions in AI that Carlos is going to walk us through just to level set the terminology. Carlos is then going to talk about algorithm development complexity. You know, what are some of the challenges and walk us through an example of algorithm development. Dave Vogel is going to talk about the current regulatory and FDA stance around AI incorporation in medical devices, and then Adam will talk about systems complexity and architecture for the overall systems that incorporate AI. And then we'll have a quick wrap up, and our goal is to save 10 minutes for questions at the end. So I want to start with the question of why is this important now? You know, we're hearing a lot of excitement about AI in a number of industries as well as healthcare. And it brings to mind one of my favorite quotes, which is Amara's Law. We tend to overestimate the effect of a technology in the short run and underestimate the effect in the long run. And that begs another question. Are we in the short run or the long run right now with AI? And to help answer that, I want to provide a little context. We're going to provide this deck, and we have a bibliography of some of the references we used in putting it together. But this was put together by Forbes, and this is just a sampling of some of the different milestones in the evolution of AI. As you can see, it goes back quite a bit. I want to call out a few things as we get a little closer here. It was in 1995 that a chatbot was developed that pulled sample data from the web. And I think that's an important milestone, because a lot of why I think this is particularly relevant today is the connectivity of systems. We'll talk about that a bit more later. In 1997, Deep Blue became the first computer chess playing program to beat a world champion. Right? It's one thing when you're automating tasks with artificial intelligence. It's another when it is doing a task better than even the best in the world can do. And then to bring us up to near real time, in January of this year, Representative Jake Auchincloss, a congressman from Massachusetts, delivered a speech on the House floor that was completely generated by Chat GPT, which is starting to demonstrate how this technology can be used in sort of broader and more complex ways. I want to talk about some of the current synergies for why, in terms of are we in the short run or the long run. My feeling is that we're entering sort of that longer run where more significant impact is going to start to be felt. This is driven by a pervasive number of connected systems. We're seeing it more and more. A lot of our work actually has to do with connected medical devices, enabling and vastly increasing the data that is collected and available. And it's also in many cases providing multiple data points in which to identify patterns and even make predictions. We have cloud processing, cloud storage, which is really improving the capacity that's needed to house the data, but as well as to process some of these algorithms. I bet most of us have a smartphone on us right now, and that's not brand new, but relatively speaking, that's a newer trend. And wearables in terms of healthcare data, particularly in the cardiac space, more and more wearables, more and more sort of ongoing monitoring of patients, or not even patients, who are getting monitored. And then there are always cost pressures in healthcare. In the U.S., we spend 18.3% of GDP on healthcare, pretty significant number. And really, there's we're looking for drivers to reduce that cost. And in addition to reducing costs, and we talk about this a bit here, we always want to improve outcomes, right? So as far as what some of these drivers are, can we improve outcomes? Can we reduce costs? And we're starting to see some real viable options there. I want to also talk about the commercial potential. This is exciting in a lot of ways, but it is big business. So that the U.S. commercial potential for AI-driven healthcare, so this is U.S. specifically, is projected, depending on the model that you look at, to be 34.5 billion to 72 billion by 2027, right? And 2027 is just not that far away. And with a compound annual growth rate in the mid-30 range, again, but depending on the model, that is very significant in terms of its growth, in terms of the commercial opportunity. What is AI doing? A lot of what it's doing in some of these applications is extracting signal from noise. There's a lot of data, which is the noise, and finding a pattern that's meaningful is really identifying that signal. There's a couple examples that are playing out now that I want to talk about. One is retinal scanning. The disease state is macular degeneration. The location of this work in particular was in the UK, where there was a large backlog of patients who needed to be treated for macular degeneration, or even formally diagnosed, and people were losing vision in queue to getting care. And the use of AI in identifying, diagnosing has been a huge help to reduce that backlog and move through patients more quickly. An exciting sort of offshoot of that is in looking at the retina. We have blood vessels in the eye that are more exposed without any obstruction than anywhere else in the body. And the potential for analyzing those vessels and the blood within those vessels as an alternative to blood drawing is something that's being worked on now. And in the disease states of diabetes, as well as various heart disease, that can be a significant help. Another example is AI-assisted breast cancer detection. This work was done out of Hungary, and one of the outcomes of this work is a increase in cancer detection of 13%. So 13% of patients who would not have been identified just by a physician looking were detected to have cancer, and therefore that means early treatment, which clearly from a clinical perspective is significant. And then it cut down on radiologists' workloads because they were able to focus more quickly on the meaningful images and areas of interest, and it cut it down by 30%. Again, a very significant number. Again, why are we talking about this now? Well, because it's clearly becoming more and more common. This is a graph. The 2022 data is not complete. That asterisk is going to be a little bit small, but you can clearly see the trend of more and more submissions being made to the FDA that involve AI or ML. And you can also see in green, that represents radiology. So most of the applications, the majority right now, are in radiology. And one of the reasons that I think that's important is, really some of the challenges here are worth noting as we transition really into the heart of the webinar here. What is the business case? Is there a realistic application? In some cases there are not, but certainly in many cases there are. And radiology and image analysis is one of the early ones that we're seeing a lot of attention to, and I think there will be a lot more as this progresses. Another challenge is regulatory. The FDA is not in an easy position. This technology is moving very, very quickly, and they do not want to stifle innovation, while at the same time they have to make sure that products that are released are safe and effective. And so understanding, and this will be covered by Dave today, understanding really the regulatory framework is really important in being successful. Understanding that can really help with the planning and set expectations of what needs to be done. And then last, what will be covered by Adam is architecting systems with significant variation in rates of change. We'll talk about this a bit more, but medical devices, many of them are already complex. Adding a technology like artificial intelligence can really add to that complexity, right? And so different approaches around design and development in light of the regulation, in light of good engineering practices and other regulations, and really that systems thinking we feel is critical. We wanted to walk through, again, some AI terminology and definitions, and Carlos, I'd invite you to unmute and talk us through this.
First of all, thank you, Matt, for inviting me to participate in this very interesting and exciting webinar. And before jumping into my presentation, I would like to discuss about common terminology that we are going to be using along the webinar. So when we say artificial intelligence, we will be referring to a branch of computer science dealing with the simulation of intelligent behavior in computers. Whereas when talking about machine learning, we will be referring to the use and development of computer systems that are able to learn and adapt without following explicit instructions, by using algorithms and statistical models to analyze and draw inferences from patterns in data. And finally, algorithm learning types, supervised learning, where known outcomes predict the next value, and unsupervised learning, where unknown outcomes identify clusters. Next slide, please. Next slide. So developing an AI-based analytical tool is a very complex and difficult task. Indeed, 3 weeks ago appeared in TechCrunch this very interesting article where the author stated that almost 85% of all AI projects fail to reach the production or operation stage. And this is because of the FOMO around AI that was developed in the last couple of years, pushed companies and executives to take action quickly, despite not having a clear understanding of the overall impact, planned cost, and resources involved in creating a successful AI program. And now I will show you a clear example of all of this. Next slide, please. This is about the story of a mid-sized biotech that had successfully developed blood analytics to detect at early stage a very particular type of cancer. So they decided to move forward and be in front of their competitors, and they think in about developing an AI-based analytical tool to automatically depict their output, because up to the moment, the machine was given an output that the pathologist needed to work manually. So for this purpose, they hired a team of data analysts that analyzed the case, and they set up a clear use case. They said, well, this is a classical binary classifier classification problem. So in this case, what we need to do is to separate the cancer samples from the non-cancer samples and output in very clear metrics the results as they are showed in the left side of the slide. So almost perfect separation between the two different populations. And when they analyze the timing, they say, well, this will take to us around 3 months. So 1 year after starting the program, they continued to struggle in defining and developing this binary classifier. And the problem was that they misunderstood the equation that they were trying to solve, because it was not generating a binary classifier between cancer and non-cancer samples, but it was in between a certain type of this particular cancer, because this particular type of cancer was divided into subtypes. Type 1 tumors that are that present a high risk and are a very aggressive disease that is related to a threat of death for the patients and presents very high levels of expression of all the markers, and type tumors that are also cancer, but presents lower expression of the markers that are being tested in their blood analytics. This low risk type of cancer that is protracted clinically, completely different from the type 1 tumors, and in terms of biomarkers are more associated to the non-malignant or normal samples. And the data scientist team misunderstood this. And so that's why they couldn't manage to get a successful result with their binary classifier, and the program failed. So how can you avoid this type of situation? So the antidote, and next slide, please, Matt, is called DVD. From the very beginning, you have to, first of all, perform a correct design. So identify the problem you're trying to solve. Identify the clinically meaningful of the problem that you are trying to solve. Second, find the best model for your input data. And finally, from the very beginning, think about how your model will be deployed for the user. Next slide, please. So, key messages for the design step. First of all, you need to find out if AI is the appropriate solution for the problem, because maybe it is not, and you would use a very powerful tool in order to solve a problem that you don't need to use AI. But imagine that this is the case. Then once you have decided that the AI is the appropriate solution for your problem, you need to set meaningful, clearly articulated goals for your use cases. And of course, once you have set up that the question that you need to answer is clinically meaningful, you need to also understand your data to avoid problems as we have seen in the example, and do make sure that you have enough data, because you can have a lot of data, but it's not the appropriate data to answer the clinically meaningful question, or you can have the right data, but not have the data in enough amount. And finally, what is really important for the design part is the team culture, because this is not a problem of data scientists or engineers. It's a problem of data scientists, engineers, and domain experts. And this is a must do. You must include from the very beginning domain experts that will evaluate the clinically meaningfulness of the question that you need to ask and the data that you have in order to see whether you can answer your question by using this data. And to generate this team culture takes time, because data scientists, engineers, and domain experts are coming from many different disciplines. They speak their own language, and it's really hard to pull them all together. So these are not programs to be solved in 1 month or 1 month and a half. Team culture takes time, and you need to take the time that it needs to generate this team culture, because this is going to result in a successful AI program. Next slide, please. Key messages for the build part. First of all, you need to consider the complexity of the model you want to use, because we are all prone to use the more complex and fashionable last model, but maybe you need a simplest model that you are not going to obtain highest metrics, but it's enough, and it's going to generalize better to the different data types that you can encounter at the real world situation. Of course, you need to evaluate many different models and use various format metrics that are adapted to the type of data sets that you are working on. And remember, there is no one size fits all solution. Every case is different. And of course, you need a lot of experimentation to find the best model for your data. Next slide. And about key messages for the deployed step. So infrastructure for the acquisition of the input medical data. You can have the best model, but if you cannot access the data that you need to test, the model will be useless. So I think Adam is going to speak more about this in his discussion. Secondly, integrate your technology into real clinical environments and adapt it to a multitude of different scenarios. And finally, for each use case, you need collaboration across teams and future users before, during, and after the implementation. So if you want to end with a successful AI-based analytical tool, next slide, please. Don't forget, DVD is the solution. Must do, include domain experts from the very beginning. For each case, collaboration across teams and future users is the key. There is no one-size-fits-all solution. You need to adapt your solution case per case. And of course, this is not just a 1-month program. You need a lot of experimentation to find the best model to be adapted to your data. So this is all what I wanted to say you in my 10 minutes. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Carlos. Appreciate that. Next, we want to talk about FDA's current thinking on AI from a regulatory standpoint. Dave?
All right, thanks, Matt. So there are a few publications from the FDA that you should know about. I've listed them here, and when you receive your copy of the slides after the webinar, you can download them from the links at the end of each one if you don't have these already. Note that this is an actively evolving topic with the FDA, and we're likely to see a lot of changes on these documents. Can you go to the next slide, please, Matt? So what are these documents and how do they relate to each other? The two publications on the left are not specific to AI, but are important for historical context and will help us understand where we think the FDA might be heading and how they'll get there. Those two publications deal with software as a medical device, or SAMDs as they're often called, and as I'll call them here. Prior to the advent of devices built around consumer electronics like smartphones, SAMDs were the exception, and medical device software was well regulated and directed by another FDA publication called the General Principles of Software Validation, or GPSV. However, medical software in the form of apps on iPhones made it necessary for the FDA to clarify what medical apps fit the definition of a medical device and thus would be regulated. Additionally, they provided further guidance on which of those that were deemed to be devices might be eligible for enforcement discretion and might have a shorter pathway to making it to market. What does this all have to do with AI? AI seems to be following a similar process at the FDA. First came recognition that AI software is different from embedded software in the way it's developed and how it changes throughout the product life cycle. Second, decisions were made to clarify what kinds of AI applications will be regulated and which will not. And finally, we can expect future suggestions or guidance on how industry will need to communicate to the FDA that AI-based devices are safe and effective. The action plan document in the lower right of this slide lays out the FDA's intent on providing more detailed guidance. In a way, we are today with AI software where we were with embedded software in the mid-1990s before the issuance of the GPSB. With that explanation, the two documents on the right are AI specific. The top one is a discussion paper that was issued by the FDA in 2019 on a proposed framework for how the FDA might regulate AI software. The second publication in the lower right is an action plan that responds to industry comments that were collected on the framework and lays out goals for the agency in implementing the framework. We go to the next slide, please. This figure represents the proposed structure for regulating AI software, and it's taken directly from that 2019 framework reference that I mentioned earlier. It has not yet risen to the level of a guidance, let alone a regulatory requirement, but it is moving in that direction. The white boxes in this figure are the product development activities, where we at Full Spectrum spend most of our time. And we'll be speaking more about that in upcoming sections of this webinar. The orange boxes are product lifecycle processes, activities, and documentation. The blue circle or octagon with a 4 in it is a lifecycle requirement for performance monitoring after product deployment. This is critical to monitor the safety and effectiveness of the device as the model or algorithm evolves once exposed to real-world data, or as it is simply retrained to improve performance. Though device manufacturers have always been responsible for post-market surveillance, this is post-market surveillance on steroids. This is one of the largest differences between the proposed AI regulatory software structure and traditional embedded software regulation. The implications of this are far-reaching, but to start with, one could infer from this that development of AI-based software is never complete, since it is continuously monitored, improved, and controlled. Finally, last comment I'll make on this figure, the green arrow is the feedback path for revising the model and improving performance based on post-market monitoring of performance. There's not time to discuss this figure in more detail, but it is an excellent summary of how the FDA is currently looking at AI software and their opportunities to regulate it. Let's move to the next slide. The framework document suggests that AI ML software be developed using good machine learning practices, or GMLP. The guidance doesn't specify in detail what that means, other than to suggest the 4 best practice categories that are shown in this slide. I do want to point out that in the highlighted areas under other considerations, there are several references to clinical relevance. And this really emphasizes a point that Carlos made, that since AI software replaces or supplements the role of clinicians, it would be reasonable to expect that GMLPs would include more interactions with clinicians than for other software-driven devices. Transparency of output, also highlighted at the bottom, is another concept that's been discussed by the FDA for some time related to artificial intelligence. Transparency addresses the question, how do we know that the AI findings are correct or even reasonable? Transparency of output leaves a trail of assumptions, logic, and choices made by the software to allow the user to understand how the AI algorithm came to its conclusion. Next slide, please. There's another concept introduced in the framework document, the Predetermined Change Control Plan, or PCCP. This is not a replacement for all the activities and deliverables currently mentioned in the general principles of software validation, but is an extension to the expectations for change control plans that are specific to the way changes in AI algorithms result as they are exposed to enhanced training data and/or real-world data. Let's spend just a minute trying to understand what problem the FDA is addressing with the PCCP. One of the very valuable features of an AI or ML-based device is its ability to adapt and improve performance rapidly as it is exposed to larger data sets. The FDA recognizes the value of this in medical device algorithms and doesn't want to restrict the agility of AI ML algorithm changes. On the other hand, the FDA has a responsibility to assure the safety and efficacy of devices, and thus needs some control or insight into the changes that are being made to the core algorithms. In trying to find the right balance of agility and control, the FDA is suggesting that manufacturers analyze their artificial intelligence applications and make a best effort to anticipate what improvements in performance might be expected with algorithmic changes. Further, anticipated changes in intended use also should be documented in a SAMD, software as a medical device, pre-specification, or SPS. The SPS will be reviewed by the FDA with the device submission. Additionally, the FDA will expect and review an algorithm change protocol, which will detail the methods by which the manufacturer will analyze and control risk associated with changes to the algorithm as a result of retraining of the algorithm after the device was cleared by the FDA. Let's go to the next slide. The SPS and ACP are new types of documentation not previously required by the FDA. Naturally, we're all quite interested in what they have in mind that should be communicated in these documents. The table in this slide is also taken from the framework document and gives us a glimpse into the current thinking of the FDA on the contents of the ACP. We could probably spend an hour on this slide alone, but I want to point out just two high-level observations today. First, I want to point out that the red arrow is pointing at yet another reference to clinician involvement. So I think we can't overemphasize how important clinician involvement is in AI. If AI is designed to mimic the reasoning of clinicians, then they must be involved in testing and analyzing test results to assure that the algorithm is performing as expected and specified. The second thing to point out is that the remaining bullets in this table are mostly pieces of information the FDA feels are needed to provide transparency into the objectives of retraining, the retraining and retesting methodologies, and the logic behind when and how retraining decisions are made. The action plan in reference number 2 of the bibliography prioritizes the development of guidance documents by the FDA to further detail the expectations for the PCCP and its subcomponents, the SPS and ACP. Next slide, please. So I said the FDA wants to encourage the agility of AI retraining and getting updated algorithms to the field as quickly as possible. So some of you are wondering how adding 2 more major types of documentation is going to keep the process agile. It's true that for the initial pre-market review by the FDA, represented by the gray boxes on the left of this figure, this does add to regulatory burden. However, the approved SPS and ACP that comes out of the pre-market submission and approval process becomes the main tool for communication with the FDA for subsequent retraining and retesting of the algorithm. This is shown in the blue boxes in the middle of the figure. Changes that normally wouldn't trigger a new 510K and changes that are not outside the performance changes anticipated by the SPS and ACP will result only in documents to your file. If the modifications lead to new intended uses, a whole new FDA pre-market review will be triggered. Additionally, further review by the FDA will be required if the modifications lead to performance changes not anticipated by the SPS and ACP. If the unanticipated results do not create new intended uses, then the FDA review will likely be limited to a review of the revised SPS and ACP. So there are some significantly shorter regulatory pathways for routine performance improvements that do not introduce unexpected changes to the device. With that, I'll turn this over to Adam to discuss how the proper architecture of AI ML systems can streamline the development and regulatory review processes. Adam?
Thanks, Dave. Over the last several years, Elon Musk has held several talks about the machine that builds the machine, or the factory, not only describing the importance of treating the factory like a product, but also the complexity of the factory. This is analog to the application of AI to regulated medical devices. The controls that Dave just described are not just procedural controls. They are controls that need to be built into your system architecture. The AI itself is exciting, but it is likely less complicated than the ecosystem or factory in which it operates. If you're in the process of or intending to include artificial intelligence in a medical device, then you are attempting to harness the power of data to get smarter over time. This is powerful, but it also means that performance could change rapidly. This creates a number of risks that need to be managed. How do you handle drift? If the system is learning, are you able to verify the results are not degrading? How do you improve outcomes over time? If production is generating new data, how are you managing that this data is improving your model? How will you manage version control in a compliant fashion? We have likely all been managing software versions for some time now, but now your model is a combination of a software algorithm and data. Over the next few slides, I'll be walking through some critical ilities to be considered as your architecture is developed. Next slide, please. First is configurability. As described earlier in the presentation, there are a few key decisions that need to be made. Are you deploying a static or dynamic algorithm? If dynamic, is it learning in a supervised or unsupervised fashion? In this example, I've assumed all of the above, and the architecture will need to be capable of managing each configuration. To manage performance changing in real time, you may need multiple static models executing simultaneously. The orange boxes on this slide represent models being used in a clinical setting. One being used for US clinicians and the other for clinicians in Europe. The difference between models 1 and 2 may be driven by population differences or different regulatory cycles where model 2 is approved in Europe, but not yet in the US. In order to support rapid learning cycles, model 3 may be for internal users attempting to optimize outcomes by continuously improving the data set. In this example, I'm assuming a supervised learning approach is being used where the operations user is curating the data in collaboration with clinician users. I'll talk more in a couple slides about what you do once you have an improved data set. Lastly, model 4 may be leveraged by internal or external researchers where unsupervised learning is preferred. As Carlos discussed, experimentation is critical continuing to advance outcomes. This structure allows for rapid experimentation without impacting real-world performance until you're ready. Next slide, please. Next is observability. Building on the example from the previous slide, each model would represent different levels of performance. On the right side of this chart, there's a confusion matrix represented for each model. A confusion matrix is one visual tool to be able to view the accuracy of a model. For models 3 and 4, the accuracy will change as the data sets evolve. whereas models 1 and 2 are static, but the performance may be changing over time due to external forces such as variable image quality. In any of these 4 cases, it is critical that you can assess the changing accuracy of each model, as well as drill down into the data to identify the data that is confusing. A data set may be confusing because of poor data, or it may drive you to improve feature extraction. At this point, the lines between pre-market verification and post-market surveillance become somewhat blurred. The same tools and techniques needed to observe performance post-market can be applied to pre-market verification. I'll discuss DevOps in a couple of slides, but this effectively builds a self-test capability that can be executed throughout your development, test, and pre-production environments. Next slide, please. The last ability I will cover is variability. Each model can be supported by a variable data set. In this graphic, you can see model 4 going off the page. This is your research data set using unsupervised learning. The data model can grow very rapidly, allowing your research team to look for new patterns driving the next evolution of your algorithm. In order to verify performance of your algorithm, the system architecture must be able to track the provenance of each data set and regenerate each model, as well as port each model between environments. With data sets with thousands or even millions of records, it is a critical automation task that should be built into your system and not left as a system administrator task. Next slide, please. Looking at the full DevOps life cycle, most of us are used to seeing the top part of this diagram, code being developed, tested, and promoted through a series of environments or test devices with increasing control as production is approached. MLOps is the latest buzzword for the techniques used for managing the transition of data sets and models from production down to development, then back up again. Your best source of new data is your production system, so an efficient method to move data from production to lower environments is critical. And given that we're in the healthcare space, managing privacy adds another layer of complexity. As you're moving data out of production, how are you ensuring that the data has been appropriately de-identified? Next slide, please. In conclusion, the system architecture must support the full life cycle of the algorithm. We've covered 3 important abilities: variability, managing different data sets; observability, observing and managing performance across multiple models; and configurability, managing multiple models simultaneously. These need to be considered in addition to the other relevant system abilities such as scalability, extensibility, and reliability. As part of this architecture effort, it is critical to identify the abilities that are relevant to the product and ensure the system architecture addresses each. Initial business decisions will shape the system architecture. The general example I have covered assumes a centralized deployment in the cloud, but the solution will be much different if the intelligence is distributed to individual devices. We've also covered static versus dynamic algorithms. Both have value, but require different control mechanisms. And lastly, supervised versus unsupervised learning. Making these decisions up front and starting with an architecture that supports them will set up your AI initiative for success.
Thank you, Adam. We wanted to wrap up with some key takeaways, ask a few poll questions, and then move into the question and answers. A couple of things that we wanted to call out here that we feel are worth remembering. It is our belief that AI is inevitable at this point. It is getting past a tipping point. And so, is it going to have a big impact on our lives? Yes, I think we're seeing that play out now. When is it going to really reach a point of meaning in healthcare? I think it's starting. It has a long arc of its evolution, which we talked about, but it still has a long way to go. A lot of the factors that we talked about today do give examples of why it still has a long way to go in healthcare. It is hard to regulate. It is hard to develop these models, if some of the thinking up front hasn't been done appropriately and the right understanding is there. There's also a challenge that we've seen in the medical device industry at a number of different points. Embedded software is much easier to maintain and in many ways deal with than when you move to the cloud. So, embedded software is relatively simple compared to opening yourself up to the world and the rate of change that is experienced in the cloud. we're going through another step where, going from the cloud to incorporation of AI has an even greater degree of implied continuous development and rate of change, right? If we were to take this back a step further or go back in history a little bit more in the medical device industry, we'd be talking about the change from device companies being hardware companies to realizing that there's more software than hardware now. These are natural evolutions that we're seeing, and we're seeing that we're entering this around AI, and there's still a fair amount to go, though the impact has begun. Another point that we wanted to make that we feel, comes out in a number of areas throughout this presentation is the need for planning and forethought. We have all been involved in programs, at least those of us here, where maybe there's a company that gets pretty close to being done with development or feeling that they're done with development and starting to think about compliance at the end, reverse engineering of documentation or, other key artifacts. We don't feel that that's possible with systems that are as complex as those that incorporate AI. The amount of forethought and the understanding of the problem and the understanding of the planning and the understanding of how it will be tested is too important, and to try to do that at the end, we don't feel is going to be an effective approach. And then last but not least, I wanted to reiterate some things about the algorithm development itself. One major challenge that still exists and is still being dealt with is data hygiene. Is the data clean? Is the data really representative of the broader population? Or if it's representative of a segment of the population, is that well understood? We know about the move towards precision medicine that we're seeing in the pharmaceutical realm, but depending on the data set being used, that may also be true in the training of an algorithm. And then, last but not least, a theme we've been hitting on quite a bit, algorithm development and the solution development in this space is a team sport. This is not just about data science or engineering or subject matter and clinical expertise. It really is the marriage of all those coming together to come up with effective programs to design systems and algorithms that answer the question that is the most important one. So, with that, Nicole, if you would launch the poll, we'd like to walk through that and then move into Q&A. And you should have a question pop up on your screen, and we'll just roll through these as quickly as possible. All right, I think we're on the last question. All right. Well, thank you. And then there's a number of questions that have come up in the chat, and so I'm going to invite the panelists to unmute because that way, you can answer when I call on you unexpectedly. Some great questions in the chat. How do you see AI being most relevant in the near to midterm? Was a question. So I'll take that one quickly. I really do think, as we were, evidenced by the submissions and the concentration of submissions and volume of submissions in the radiological space, it does seem like that is one of the areas where it is, more ready, more able to come up with, really clinically meaningful solutions. The examples that I used around macular degeneration and breast cancer identification were both image-based AI. Carlos, I would ask you though, just in the space of developing these algorithms, if you have anything to add to that.
Yes, although computer vision systems are the more advanced, it takes, you need to really think about what do you expect from these systems when you are developing them. Because are you going to target, for example, if you're working with chest X-ray, are you going to develop an algorithm that can be adapted to chest X-ray machines in order to analyze general information, for example, the presence or absence of abnormal radiological signs, or are you going to develop a very specific algorithm to detect one particular lesion? And this will change your development design, because on one side you need massive data sets in order to really very well generalize the results. On other, you will need balanced data sets with mostly the disease that you are targeting very well present in these data sets to develop the rightful tool.
Thank you, Carlos. There's two questions that I think are good ones. I'm going to combine. Do you think that AI as a technology has sufficiently matured in order to be integrated? And then there was another question on just how to integrate AI into technologies at this point. In terms of the maturity, I don't think it's a one size fits all. All algorithms are not created equally, and all use cases for those algorithms are not created equally. Algorithms have been used for a long, long time. Some of them very simple, a lookup table, perhaps, a sorting feature. But we're talking about much more sophisticated AIs. So again, Dave or Carlos, if you want to add to that in terms of the maturity of AI, can that be answered holistically, or is you have to be broken down to really answer that?
Dave?
I think it's the same answer I would have given 50 years ago, that it's still continuing to mature, and it's probably going to continue maturing for the foreseeable future. On the other hand, I don't think that's a reason not to jump in and start integrating it in with medical devices. I don't remember if I heard this as part of our background research for this webinar or I heard it somewhere else, but somewhere recently I heard that there have been over 500 FDA submissions for artificial intelligence. So, we're not at the bleeding edge anymore if there are already 500 submissions out there. I think another, not that I'm trying to create fear of missing out, FOMO, but in another webinar that was given this week, it was pointed out that one of the real challenges with AI is finding AI engineers. They have been blotted up, not just by the medical device industry, but virtually every industry. So, this doesn't, there's another question here, is AI a fad or a hype cycle? I think it's going to go in the bucket with graphic user interfaces, internet connectivity, cloud-based computing, smartphone apps, all these things that felt faddish at the beginning, but now are just accepted part of the landscape in medical devices. And my feeling is AI is going to be just like that.
Adam, in terms of the integration of AI with medical devices from a technological standpoint, do you want to comment on its readiness?
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly ready. As you know, as we discussed a lot through this webinar, it's really about control. So we've certainly seen applications, particularly when you look at cases where you're generating new data or a lot more data than can be practically reviewed by a clinician, such as the patient monitoring space. So there's several applications where it is happening, and then how you do it really depends on a lot of the things I discussed. Is it something that you're trying to get into your device? Is it something where you're putting it into a back-end process to help with identification of patients who need help? So the how specifically is got to be related to your product and your use case, really back to those initial business decisions.
And then I guess we all, Carlos, you have your hand up, and all the panelists have visibility of the questions. So if there's any ones in particular you want to answer, go ahead. And Carlos, please go ahead.
Yeah, no, just a few comments over maturity. It's not just maturity of AI, it's maturity of data sets and maturity of your questions. If your questions are immature, you have immature data, you can have the most potent mature model that you're not going to be able to answer your questions. So the maturity is about the whole program, the whole project.
And there was another question that maybe that's a good segue into, which is the question was, if we're planning on incorporating AI in a medical device, when would you start building out your AI team?
Well, I will say that depends on whether you have already the medical device or you will start from zero. If you start from zero, you need to start thinking as the medical device with AI as a whole. So from the very beginning.
Okay. There's another question, Dave. This might be more for you, and then Nicole, if we do have the answer of the results of the poll, love to share them with everybody. It'd be interesting to see. But the question, Dave, is should the SPS or ACP be changed post-market as new opportunities are discovered? Would a new regulatory submission be required, with or without a change in intended use?
So the short answer is yes. I think those are meant to be, and we'll find out more when we do get a guidance from the FDA on this, but I think they're meant to be living documents that will evolve along with the product. And I think only in the cases of evolving into new intended uses or something that's radically outside the bounds of what the predecessor SPS ACP outlined would get serious FDA review. I think what the FDA is trying to do with this framework is try to corral the review activity for AI devices around the PCCP, which includes the SPS and ACP. I think they're trying not to do a full pre-market review of products, but only focus narrowly on that PCCP. So it does need to evolve as the product evolves.
Thank you, Dave. And I know we didn't get to all the questions. We will send out this presentation, or at least make it available with contact information included. Be happy to answer questions or continue the discussion. This is something all of us are, very interested and passionate about. Clearly a relevant topic. You can't, go through a day without a new headline around it, or many more than one. I don't know, Nicole, if you can show oh yeah, I guess they're up there. Or no, they're not. There they are. So question one, if anyone's interested in seeing these results, we're going to show them. But just want to say thank you. This has been a real pleasure. Really appreciate Nicole, you and the whole MassMedic team working on this in collaboration with us, and it's really been enjoyable. And happy that everyone could participate. And interesting to see these answers. I'm glad the majority doesn't think 10 years and beyond. And very glad that number 3 here didn't take the day. AI for marketing purposes is not I don't think as valuable as trying to answer real clinical questions. But this is great. Again, thank you, everyone. Thank you, Nicole. It's been a real pleasure.
All right. Well, I just have to echo what you said, Matt. It seems like we could continue this conversation for much longer. Lots of interest, which is fabulous. So thank you again to Full Spectrum Software for hosting today's webinar. We cannot put on these great educational programs without support from our members like you. So thank you. And thank you everyone for joining us today. We hope that you found value out of this, and please come to massmedic.com/events to find out all the other great events we have coming up. Look forward to seeing you next time. Thanks.